Now, let's talk about what's holding up progress on a Bill of Rights here. An ad hoc Assembly committee was set up in accordance with the new decade new approach deal to consider creating a Bill of Rights faithful to the stated intention of the Good Friday Agreement. It's due to report in February of next year, but a panel of human rights experts to advise the committee still has not been appointed.
Well, the Sinn Féin chair of the committee, Emma Sheeran, tweeted last week, "I am deeply frustrated that the DUP are obstructing this important work by blocking the appointment of the panel of experts on the basis of their objection to one eminently qualified expert with decades of experience on human rights promotion."
Yeah, and subsequently, the journalist Amanda Ferguson tweeted that she understood the person being blocked was Professor of Human Rights in the School of Law at Queen's University, Colin Harvey. That subsequently was followed up by the Irish News, and I'm pleased to say that Colin Harvey joins me now. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Chris.
First of all, let's talk about the wider issue. Just explain to people what this whole Bill of Rights idea is and why it's important.
Well, Chris, I'm going to start this morning by saying that my thoughts are very much with the family and friends of Austin Curry this morning. It's apt, I think, that we're reflecting on the civil rights movement, and here we are this morning discussing human rights and a Bill of Rights again. Obviously, I'm responding to reports about this expert panel that is a commitment, a new decade, new approach. And essentially that panel hasn't been established. So I'm responding to reports about the reason behind that. The panel was there to assist the committee in its work. The committee is now essentially fairly close to conclusion of its work. So I think there's a major problem here. But my view is that the focus should be on the Bill of Rights, why that hasn't been delivered. There are people in the here and now who need those rights to be delivered. So I think that's where the focus should be, and not primarily on my own personal situation.
And that was why I asked the question initially about the Bill of Rights itself. Do you want to just explain why it is important and what the Bill of Rights actually means?
Well, the Bill of Rights is a process in the Good Friday Agreement. The Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission submitted advice in 2008 for Bill of Rights for here. It essentially hasn't been delivered, and it's been stalled since. New Decade, New Approach gave people hope. The process had gained momentum again with this new Assembly committee and with this panel of experts that hasn't been established, and we're waiting to see what happens. But essentially, we did polling earlier this year. Queen's Ulster University Human Rights Consortium was published in June, which showed that there's wide-ranging cross-community support for legally enforceable human rights in this society. So I think ultimately now we want to see delivery. It's a final phase of the process.
But do we not have them? But do we not have them? If you take a look at what is actually in place, and if you take a look at, for example, the European human rights that still exist in Northern Ireland for those people who regard themselves as Irish and everything else, are they're not still enshrined in our legislation, both with the UK and with the EU, this idea of human rights for everyone?
We have the Human Rights Act. We have protections also in the protocol that often are overlooked and not mentioned. But there are more and additional human rights that we don't have here. And, the focus of our work earlier in the year was those bread and butter socioeconomic human rights around health, accommodation and standards of living. The levels of multiple deprivation in this region, some of the highest levels of poverty anywhere across these islands. These basic socioeconomic rights are not in place. There's widespread cross-community support to see them enforced in a Bill of Rights. There's a reasonable expectation that this Good Friday Agreement promise would be delivered. So now ultimately we want to see this delivered. I'm responding to reports about my position on the panel. The reports that I'm hearing, my perspective after my experiences of the last few years, are entirely plausible. But, the focus today, particularly when we're thinking about civil rights and human rights, is getting on with delivering a Bill of Rights in this society.
Well,
let's talk
about
those rights most.
And we have set out now exactly what the wider issue is. But let's talk about this political row, because Sinn Féin have said that they believe the DUP are obstructing the appointment of a panel of experts. Do you believe it is you they are objecting to?
It's entirely plausible. My experience over the last number of years since engaging in the constitutional conversation an entirely perfectly legitimate constitutional conversation about the future of this island, you will know, everybody listening to this programme will know that people have, taken a position in relation to my stance on that. So the reports that I'm hearing are entirely plausible. I'm deeply saddened to hear those reports, but our focus, people need to keep their eyes on the prize. The prize for this society is a Bill of Rights that protects the people in this society listening to this programme who need those rights in place.
Yeah, but just to be clear on this, you have given evidence to this committee. You have put forward the information that you feel is important to this committee. It's not the case that you haven't been listened to here. These are decisions that are being made by a committee of MLAs. The job that you essentially have applied for is to give evidence and to give information to that committee. And actually, you've done that.
I've been working on a Bill of Rights for 2 decades, Chris, and making my views known. This was a formal commitment in New Decade, New Approach to establish this particular 5-person panel, which I was interviewed for, I applied for, and nearly 18 months later, that panel, which was there to assist the committee in its work, a formal panel, a requirement of NDNA hasn't been appointed. Everyone listening to this, but
the point I'm making here, is that you have actually given evidence to this committee. You have actually given information to this committee. The difference of being on a panel of experts and giving that information essentially as a witness, for want of a better word, to that committee. I mean, the difference is basically that in one of the circumstances you'd be paid and the other one you wouldn't. Isn't that true?
I think there's a wider point here, Chris, about a commitment in New Decade, New Approach. I'm a human rights professor in the School of Law at Queen's. I have views about a Bill of Rights. I've served on the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. I think there's a separate point about a principal commitment to establish a panel. Many of the people engaged in that do this work with absolutely no remuneration. So essentially, I'll continue to give my views, but I think everyone listening to this morning should be concerned that a specific commitment made in New Decade, New Approach, the basis on which power sharing has been restored nearly 18 months later, hasn't been fulfilled, and we're hearing the sorts of reasons that might be the case, and that should concern absolutely everyone in this society.
Just finally, it's supposed to report by the end of February. Do you see that happening?
I hope the committee reports. I hope the momentum is maintained, but most of all, people in this society need and deserve a Bill of Rights that is worth that name.
OK, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. That's Professor of Human Rights in the School of Law at Queen's University. That's Colin Harvey.
It is